Good morning and good afternoon. This is Kristen Schloss, and I'm from Razorleaf Corporation. I would like to welcome you to the Razorleaf's Manufacturing Suite webinar series. This is our second webinar in the series, Making Informed Decisions in the Supplier Management Process. Today, we will be taking a deep dive into our Supplier Management module for ARIS Innovator, and we'll be giving a live demo. I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers, Rodney Coffey, who is the practice manager for ARIS, and Derek Needing, who is our engagement director. Before I hand this off to Rodney, just a few housekeeping notes. First, this webinar will be recorded. We will be sharing this recording to all registrants. If one of your colleagues was unable to attend, we encourage you to share this recording. Also, during the webinar, we value your opinions and encourage questions. To ask a question, please enter on the GoToWebinar question panel at any time during this presentation. We will have a Q&A session at the conclusion of this presentation and demo. Now, I'm going to hand this over to Rodney.
Very good, thanks, Kristen. Yeah, this is going to be the second webinar in our series today, and today we're going to be focused on the supplier management section of our manufacturing suite. Before we dive into that, I wanted to just give a quick overview of what we talked about in our last session about the manufacturing suite. So the manufacturing suite is really twofold. It is either an extension of existing business applications on the ARIS platform or brand new business applications solving new challenges for our customers out there using the platform. So just a high-level view of the manufacturing suite. We have future webinars to cover some of the technical parts, and in our last introduction session we talked about all these things just from a business standpoint, what customers are doing for these things, what the needs were for us to go out and create these new business applications. So today we're going to talk about supplier management, but in the future we'll also be addressing two other suites, change management and training management, and then probably later this year cover the project management as well as NPD and issue tracking. So with that, as we mentioned last time, we focused more on the business challenges and those types of things. Today we're going to focus on the actual technology and the features and functionality of the supplier management suite. So if we take a look at the supplier management suite or module, the real purpose of this is to qualify, rank, ensure that our suppliers are getting the correct information at an earlier time in the product lifecycle. So when we think about things like the audit trail that's related to our suppliers, things of scorecards, on-site audits, certifications, all that type of information surrounding the supplier management process are the things that we're taking. So we had a really good question in the last session about how this related to supplier management that happens in ERP. There are a lot of gaps that we're filling here with the supplier module and bringing into PLM that are not addressed in ERP. So when we think about the procurement process, price, quote, those things are still often happening in the ERP system. What we're doing is giving our customers a way to solve the early supplier management challenges that they have closer to how engineering or quality departments have to manage the supply chain. So some common use cases related to this. With an automated supplier approval process, we can avoid some of the mistakes or things that happen on paper processes. So I like to use the term drive-by communication. When clients go out and they have to start finding new suppliers for their components, or they have to start qualifying new suppliers, a lot of that today is happening through email, through Excel sheets, and a lot of that gets passed around lost or poorly tracked. So having a formal process to go through and approve these suppliers, rank them, will obviously make that a much more efficient process for those businesses. This will also allow us to take the parts and find out, if I have a part in PLM, now I can see what suppliers are qualified to create that part. Or maybe there's a supplier that was at one time qualified to create that part, but upon an audit, because of some type of quality incident or things, all things tracked in PLM, we find that they are no longer qualified to do that. So it allows us to get suppliers managed, and perhaps you have a situation where a supplier goes on probation, has corrective actions to take place, which are also tracked in PLM, in order to become requalified. So that is one interesting use case that we've been able to work through with our clients. So if we take a look, as we mentioned, Supplier Management module is just one piece of the Razorleaf manufacturing suite. If we take a look at some of the things that Derek is going to show us in the technical presentation, we're going to be able to see the supplier reports, a supplier profile, and this is slightly different than the vendor profile that exists in ARIS today. We're going to talk about that. We'll have our what's commonly referred to in industry as ASL or AVL, so approved supplier list or approved vendor list. We'll see where that comes into play. This is closely related to the Supplier Scorecard, as well as achieving a status for supplier qualification. And then if we think about all the documents, I recently had a customer, they had a whole set of documents that had to go out to every supplier in order for them to be certified. So part of our workflow process, and what we'll see in the application, is when I bring in a new supplier, I know the data set, I know the documents I need them to provide and to maintain over the course of our relationship. That will allow us to get into supplier certification management, which looks like the document management arm of the supplier management module. These in a little more detail. With the supplier profile, we're extending the supplier capability beyond what's existing in the out-of-the-box ARIS vendor. We'll also be able to see where we can import existing supplier information. I should say, tied to this, a little beyond what we're going to see today, we do have a pretty large number of clients that have ERP integrations to pull the initial supplier information over, or if they choose and the supplier is initially created in PLM, we can push that to ERP. So the two systems are synced and all that information. In some cases, even the availability for the supplier to create a part. We'll also see the supplier qualification. So we'll see the requirements, where we're tracking them, how they meet those requirements, what their qualification status is. This will give us a nice supplier audit trail we can reference. The supplier scorecard and certification management. This is important for management, and on those times of audit, we'll be able to go through pretty easily in the system and show what our last audit, how that supplier performed when we were last out there to audit them, right? What things they're supposed to be working on, how they rank next to suppliers that are also providing the same parts, managing their certifications, and then obviously managing the process of auditing them, right? Most of I'll use our high-tech customers, for example. A lot of them are auditing their suppliers bi-quarterly or annually, and this allows them to manage that baseline, manage the process, the dates of which they need to go requalify the suppliers. And then, of course, for our management, our executive level, it's important to be able to have good reporting, good dashboards that we can go show them about our suppliers and how we're doing that, and we'll be able to see some of that as well. Okay. So we kind of hit on a couple of these. One thing that I wanted to hit on this slide is if we look at the supplier auditing, automates and tracks all tasks pertaining to supplier corrective actions. So this is a great example of where our business applications, our modules that we're creating as part of the manufacturing suite, are also plugging in, sitting next to other applications that are already existing on the platform. So if when we see the demonstration today, you'll see the standalone supplier management app, but tied to that are relationships for the corrective action, supplier corrective actions that are built into the out-of-the-box quality management. So the real goals of this: ensure the suppliers are performing above corporate standards and regulatory compliance, improve decision-making capabilities with a centralized, integrated view of our suppliers. So one-stop shop, right? We want to be able to get to anything in PLM related to that part, including the suppliers and all the information related to them. Obviously, we want to increase productivity, reduce design iterations. Again, if all the communication about the supplier is happening through spreadsheets, Word documents, and drive-by communication, they're more likely to have things fall through the cracks, not get tracked properly, which all lead to inefficiencies. So by getting into a uniform process, being able to pull this information in earlier in the product lifecycle, we'll be able to increase productivity. And then obviously create a better AVL, right? Increase the use of preferred suppliers to reduce sourcing issues. So this, in a lot of cases where we've solved these problems with PLM, we've not only seen our customers happy with the results of this and being able to better track their suppliers, but on the other end, their suppliers are more happy because now they are tracked more appropriately, more efficiently, and they know what's expected of them from our customers. So very excited to, that's a little bit of an overview, just some of the business cases around this. I'm very excited for you guys to actually see the technology today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Derek to do the technical demonstration.
Thank you very much, Rodney. So we'll have Kristen make me presenter, and I'll go ahead and start showing some stuff here. Give me just 1 second. All right. And Rodney, you see my screen all right?
Yep, you look good.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's go. So let's talk a little bit about, or look at some of the stuff that Rodney just walked us through and talked to us about. As he mentioned, the manufacturing suite is an add-on on top of the Aris Innovator product. And so you'll notice over here in Aris, I've got some components that represent the manufacturing suite. Rodney mentioned change management, supplier management, training management. Today we're going to focus on supplier management, then in the future we'll look at those other two as well. So supplier management does a few things for us. It's going to help us as engineers, designers, and users of the PLM system to make design decisions that take into account supplier information. So we all know that if we add a part to our bill of material, at some point that part has to go through procurement, and procurement has to find out who they can buy it from, and there's a process involved in that. If I can speed that up, and if I can make choices about parts that take supplier into account, that only helps the procurement process, that helps the time to delivery, that helps the entire process. So maybe instead of onboarding a new vendor, I can choose an alternate part that comes from a supplier that we already get parts from, and that's already an approved supplier. So there's that side of it. There's the digital twin side of it. The side that says that if I'm going to create a digital twin of my part, of my product, that I want to know everything about that. The bill of material is important, but also where I get those parts from, that's important also. So being able to track information about the suppliers of parts within my PLM system, where much of my digital twin lives, that's important also. And then Rodney mentioned just some of the supplier maintenance sort of things that needs to happen as well, like onboarding a new supplier, doing corrective action with supplier, giving a supplier a scorecard so that we can make some decisions about suppliers. Those are all some of the things that we're going to look at today. Let's start with that last one, which is about actually putting a new supplier into the system. So we'll go through and we'll take a look at, in our system, we've got a number of suppliers. Now, Rodney mentioned previously that out of the box, Aris Innovator has the ability to track suppliers or vendors or whatever you want to call them. You can do that, and it's a record in the system, and it's pretty simple. It's just a single record that you can put some attributes against. And we have that in the supplier management component as well, except we've taken it just a little bit further. So in addition to kind of the basic metadata that you might track about a supplier, we're actually putting the supplier through the process of being a supplier. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new supplier within the system. And this is a company that we could get some electronic components from. So we'll TTI North America. And we don't need to put a whole lot of other information in the system. Just fill out a couple things there. And so this is our new supplier that we're adding to the system. Now, of course, as with anything in PLM, who can add, when they can add, all of that's controlled by security, and we can set that up however we want to do that. But the point is, once I complete that, notice what happens. My supplier goes into a status of awaiting approval. And in fact, if I take a look at the workflow of a supplier, we notice that instead of just being a single record in the system, that we actually put some process behind it. So we actually can go through and start to qualify these suppliers based on a workflow process. Now, of course, those that know ARIS know that you can make this workflow process look like whatever you want it to look like, whatever your supplier onboarding process is. But the point is that now it's not just a static record in the system, but it's a record that has some process behind it. So we can take and we can certify this particular supplier. And when we certify that supplier, there's probably documentation that we need to track. So within the system, we have the ability to link documents to a supplier. At some point, we may want to know all of the parts that we buy from a supplier. We'll look at that a little bit later. We do assessments and audits against the supplier. If there's a problem, we can institute a supplier corrective action. Based on an audit, a corrective action comes out of it, and then there's some process that needs to happen there. We can do, as part of those audits, score our suppliers. Again, we'll look at that a little bit later as well. So the point is that this is not just a static record in the system that just has some metadata against it. It's a record that has some process behind it as well. So we're now able to take some of that supplier information that today may be nothing more than a contact card and try to put some of the business process behind it so that we actually are managing our suppliers, not just tracking who our suppliers are. So we'll come back and look at a couple of those other things about suppliers in just a moment, but let's actually see how we would use supplier management in action. So the day in the life and how someone's going to go about using supplier management and what benefit it brings to them. So the scenario that we've got here is that we've got a product that we want to make a change to. In this case, it's a cordless drill. So we've got a cordless drill within our system. It's a assembly. Pretty typical ARIS stuff we've got here, a BOM structure. We can see that it's got some sub-assemblies in it, and the typical stuff that you would expect to see. There's probably some CAD files for the manufactured parts that are related to this. All of the normal management sort of things that you would do against a product within the system. And I want to make a change to this, and there's a keyless chuck here. And maybe for availability reasons, quality reasons, cost reduction reasons, whatever it may be, I want to look at using a new keyless chuck. And so we've got a particular keyless chuck defined as the component that goes into this assembly. We can take a look at that. Rodney talked a little bit about the approved AVL or AML. So here's who this keyless chuck actually comes from. So the 549078, that's our internal number. And then we actually get that from the manufacturer's Thomas Hardware. It's a series A12 keyless chuck. That's going to be important for me in just a second. So I can see that information. If I take a look at that part that we get from Thomas Hardware, here's where Supplier Portal starts to help. Because now I can take a look at who do we buy that from? So we know who manufactures it. Who do we buy it from? Who are we able to get this from? And this particular part comes from McMaster-Carr. And McMaster-Carr is a certified supplier of ours. I can go in and look at McMaster-Carr. This is just like that supplier card I created just a few minutes ago. We can go in and we can look at McMaster-Carr and we can see when have we done assessments against them? What sort of audits have taken place? What is their scorecard? Have there been any corrective actions? So I'm making part decisions based on the supplier. So I'm going to not just put my blinders on and make a decision that only affects me, but I'm going to make sure that I'm thinking long-term about these part decisions. So I know something about this particular part. So we know that this series A12 drill chuck, keyless chuck, is what we want to replace. And so let's go into our system and see what we might have that we could replace this with. So we're going to search for a keyless chuck and see what we got. So there's 3 of them. The 54 is the one that we've already got within the system. And there's a 34 and a 69 as well. Let's take a look at the 69 one and see what we can learn from it. So looks like it would probably work for us. If I take a look at the AML, I can see that it is a series A12. So that's good. We want to be able to replace this with a like part. So we can do that if we want. Let me take a look at this part and see where we can get this from. And I notice I can get it from Interstate Supply. There's a problem though. They're an uncertified supplier. So if I source this part within my assembly and I put that engineering change through, by the time it gets to procurement, we're going to have some delays because one of 2 things is going to happen. Either procurement's going to say, we've got no one to buy this from. You're going to have to go back and redo that. Or procurement's going to have to say, we've got to find someone else, and that's going to take some time. I can dig into that and try to figure out why there's a problem with this supplier. If I take a look at the audits, we can see, for example, that there was an audit performed against them about a month ago. They happened to fail that audit. If I want to even dig into it, I can dig into that audit and take a look at what the reason for that failure was. There's some documentation attached that shows me that we did an audit against them. I can look at that audit and see what the reason they failed was. You're familiar with PLM, and PLM, everything starts to link together. And that's what we're trying to illustrate here, is the fact that we can start from a part, and from that part drill down to the supplier, drill down to the audits against that supplier, drill down to the documents that were created during that audit. We can see all of the information. So again, think back to that term we used earlier, digital twin. If there was ever a problem in the field with a part, with a product that used this part, it would be very easy for us to see all of the information to build that digital twin about this particular part and all the relationships that go along with it. So at the end of the day, I don't want to use this particular part, this 69 822 part. I don't want to use that because we don't have any ability to source that part. So we're going to go take a look at the other one that was available. There was one more that was available, this 348868. Let's take a look at that one and see what we think about that. So looks like it would work. If we take a look at the AML, it too is a Series A12 made by Thomas Hardware, so that's good news. That would be a direct replacement for the one that we're working with. And if I look at the suppliers, we'll notice that we can get this from Interstate Supplies. Well, that's a problem. But we can also get it from McMaster-Carr. And they are, in fact, a valid, certified, active supplier. And so that works. I can now use that part in there. Let me just show you a couple things that we have about McMaster-Carr that's kind of interesting. Something that can happen in the real world is that we can have supplier issues. And supplier issues, sometimes they're no fault of the supplier. There may be weather or facilities related issues that cause a supplier to be delayed or not have the ability to deliver a particular part. Well, the nice thing about tracking this information within our PLM system is I can go in here and I can say, what are all of the parts that I get from McMaster-Carr? So if there's a problem, if there's some sort of delay that takes place, and I want to proactively know what parts are going to have a problem, I can go in and see that information. Because we've taken the supplier and we've linked it to the parts, we now have that relationship built that allows me to see what happens when there's a problem at one of my suppliers. I have the ability to profile a supplier. Now, what profiling a supplier is about is determining something about their capabilities. So these are just some examples. Again, within your system, you would have potentially different examples, probably a whole lot more than what's here. But I could go in and I could say, you know, that this supplier is good for hazardous material handling. Well, that can become important, again, as I'm making design decisions and I want to get a particular part, and maybe there's some hazardous material consideration that I need to think about. I can look at my suppliers and find out which ones have been certified for that particular capability. So we can track that within the system. So I can see all suppliers that allow overnight delivery or that have ITAR compliance verifications or whatever the particular capability that I want to track is. Of course, as I mentioned, this list of capabilities would be whatever you want it to be. The point is I can link those to my supplier. Something interesting also happens with suppliers. Let's go back and just take a look at some of the suppliers we have in the system. And whoops, we don't want to create a new one. Let's search for some suppliers. We can, as we start working with these suppliers, we will start to build information about their capabilities. We talked about that, but also about their performance. And so through assessments and audits, and again, those assessments and audits happen through the workflow processes that are built in the PLM system, we start to build information about how they perform. So we call that a supplier scorecard. And so the supplier scorecard allows us to look at suppliers at a little bit higher level and try to get an idea on how they're performing. And so, of course, we can wrap some pretty cool looking reports around a supplier scorecard. Let me just pull up one here that allows us to see what this Acme company is all about. And so we can go in there and we can see, for example, that when we've scored them on the quality score, that they average a 5. And if I look at my graph, I can kind of see how that works out. If we look at their on-time delivery, we can see how they average there. Periodically, what's going to happen is you're going to go through and you're going to do these audits and these reviews against your supplier, and you're going to make some changes. So in this case, let's say we've reviewed them for on-time delivery again. So let's go ahead and put that in there. And this time they scored a 7. And so we'll throw a 7 in there and complete that. Now, if I go back and take a look at my supplier scorecard, we can see that we've got that information in there as well. So imagine having the ability to look at a number of different suppliers and look at these dashboards that allow me to see how that supplier is performing. Maybe a particular part is available from multiple suppliers. And from my perspective, they're all equal. The price is the same, their capabilities are the same, but how do they perform? I mean, let's choose one from a higher performing supplier if possible, and so I can see this information within the system. The key is we're trying to take information that is often in other systems, or in some cases, unfortunately, non-existent, and put it in the PLM system where some of these design decisions are being made, and allow both the engineer to take supplier information into consideration as he's making design decisions, but also allow other people in the company that maybe don't have some of these tools and allow them to track supplier information within our supplier management tools as well. So the last thing that we're going to do here is we'll go through and make our change to our keyless chuck. We decided that 348868 was the one that we wanted to change. So within the system, we can go through and edit this particular assembly, and we can do a replace. We can search for that keyless chuck and replace it with the one that we determined is the right one. Click OK. Of course, all of the background stuff that needs to happen as far as workflow processes and approvals will happen. But the point is, when this gets to the point of procurement, we know that we've chosen a part that comes from a legitimate supplier that's qualified, that's been audited. We know what their score is, and we know that that part is available from that supplier. So hopefully, as we get to that procurement process, things will go a whole lot smoother, and we won't have to kick things back to engineering because we found out that something won't work. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to show. I just want to kind of summarize a few of the things that we went through before I hand it back over to Kristen to wrap up. We started off by showing the supplier profile. So we've got the ability to track a record within the system that is the supplier information. Now, it's not just a record, though. We've put some process behind that. So remember, when we add a supplier, there's a life cycle process that happens, a workflow process, and that workflow process allows us to take that supplier through the onboarding process where they eventually become a valid, certified supplier. We also took a look at the ability to look at a given part and look at the suppliers that are available for that part. And sometimes we find that that part comes from suppliers that are approved, or they may come from suppliers that are not approved. But we're making part decisions based on what we know about the supplier information and the fact that that supplier is approved or not approved. As we go through and qualify these suppliers, we're going to be able to do audits, assessments, and scoring, along with corrective actions, and track all of that information, all of those assets that get created during those processes, track them within the PLM system. You saw how we were able to do some scorecarding against the supplier. So as a supplier is working with us, we're going to have these audits and these assessments. We can record that information. And then finally, at the end, we've got the ability to look at these dashboards that show us information about how a supplier is performing, how one supplier performs against another supplier, what suppliers are out there that have issues that we need to work with. So all of that information is wrapped up within the supplier management component within Razorleaf's manufacturing suite. So I'm going to hand it back over to Kristen, who will wrap us up and start on some questions.
Thank you, Derek. Let's get started with our Q&A session. Just a reminder, any questions, please enter your questions into the question panel of the GoToWebinar. It looks like we have one question here. How does this solution work with existing supplier management tools?
You want me to talk a little bit about that, Rodney? I'll take that one. So,
yeah, I think we might have lost Rodney.
Okay, that's good. Yep. So the key is that we find that companies fall into one of two categories. One, they've got mature, robust supplier management tools. And in those cases, we integrate with them. So Razorleaf, of course, has a Clover integration platform. Clover is our brand name, our integration platform, where we can integrate ARIS with other systems. So it may be that we want to import information from suppliers into the system. A lot of that performance and stuff may now be tracked in another system, and we simply integrate it within ARIS. So that's one answer, is that through integration, we can work with those systems. But more commonly, what we find with particularly some of the small to medium-sized companies is that they don't have a robust supplier management capabilities. They've got certainly supplier management in their MRP or ERP system, but it's not as robust as they would like it to be. And in those cases, then the answer to the question is, well, you could track that information inside of ARIS, and you could push that information to those other systems as the process would dictate. So through integration, either pulling information or pushing information, we're happy to work with either. But I think that's the right approach, is to integrate with those systems.
Thank you, Derek. Looks like we have a few more questions. Angela asks, how do you deal with package sizes? Example, we can purchase a capacitor as a single element or as a reel with 10,000 caps.
Yeah, so a lot of that happens through the within the PLM system. We've got kind of the internal part number, and then we've got the supplier or the manufacturer part number. And that's typically how that gets dealt with, is that, you know, you're not going to use within your product a reel of 10,000 capacitors. You're going to use a single capacitor. So you've got a single part number that represents that particular capacitor. But who we buy it from, well, we buy it from someone and it comes in a reel of 10,000. So you've got your part number, and then you've got your supplier part number. And that's how that works, is so you've got your manufacturer, your internal part number, then your supplier's part number. And that's typically how we handle something like that, is two separate records that of course get related to each other. Now, just to wrap that back up with supplier management, that roll of 10,000 then has to be able to be procured from some given supplier. So internally, we've got our part number. It's linked to a part number that represents a roll of 10,000. And then that part number can be bought from a series of suppliers, and that's what we would track using the supplier management capabilities. Does that make sense? Let us know if you need more information on that.
Angela, did that make sense? We'll see what she comes back. She does have another question.
Okay.
She says, can you track when a supplier part changed within a manufacturing part? Example, when one supplier part was removed.
So I'm not sure I fully understand that now. So I'll answer it kind of in a generic way, and then we can either take it offline, or Angela, if you want to ask further within the chat, go ahead. But in a generic way, my answer would be all of the records that we're tracking here are standard kind of innovator PLM records. So they all have versions and revisions, they all have audit trails, they all have histories. So as any given record changes, or any relationship between two records change, so something gets linked, unlinked, relinked, that sort of thing, all of that's getting tracked within the PLM system. So I think the short answer is yes, you can track that, because it's a PLM record that has all of the behavior of a standard PLM record. Again, if that's not quite what you're asking, just re-ask, or we can take it offline if that makes more sense.
Okay, great. Thank you, Derek.
Yep.
There is a question from Alfredo. Is there an example about integration with incoming quality inspection rules, such as skip lot routines?
So I don't know that I don't know that I fully understand that. It may be a lack of understanding of what the quality process we're talking about there is. But if the idea is that we need to do, you know, the kind of the first article inspection or the incoming inspection of a part, and then we need to record that information, that's not that. I think that's probably not the focus of the supplier management. You know, but Rodney did show that in the early discussions, he did show some direction that we're heading towards quality management. And so that's probably where some of that fits, is within some of the quality management stuff that we'll be looking at in the future.
Okay. Angela has another question regarding tracking. ARIS doesn't offer real compare options, so history and CM tracking is not really possible for the user without much tracking. So I was thinking about extending CM process, extended simple MCO, to make the changes more transparent and easy to follow. I'm just curious if Razorleaf found a solution for this.
So we have done quite a bit with some of that comparison shortcomings, if you will, that we see within the system. I probably want to talk a little more specifically with Angela and with some of our solution architects to figure out exactly what we've done that would fit. So I guess the short answer is we've got some experience there. I don't know that that experience is relevant to exactly what you're trying to do. I can tell you that we've not found a we've not hit a roadblock when it comes to building some of those reports and some of those trackings that those comparisons that you're referring to. Generally, we're able to find a way to do that either through the API or through some database reporting sort of tools. So I don't know the specific answer to your question, but I think we can we could certainly talk about what we've done in the past.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, yep, we got you, Rodney.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I disconnected. Yeah, I think as well, another good option would be to, when we have the change management webinar in a few weeks, I believe, I would definitely show up to that one and take a look at what we've done there, because we've done a lot to extend that framework to include some of those things, and there could be some viable solutions that we've used on the change management solution to also plug in here to the supply management module. But as Derek's saying, our common approach to extend on the reporting and all those types of metrics is at this point to use SQL reporting services off of the standard ARIS database. And we're doing that with, it sort of ends up looking like a data warehousing project. And we're doing that with a number of clients as we speak. So it's actually got to the point that it's such a standard thing. It's included in every one of our implementation projects that we do.
Great. Rodney mentioned ERP integration. How are you passing that information today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for our customers that don't have an existing integration platform, when they're coming to us and we're doing their initial ARIS implementation, we're usually positioning our PLM integration platform, Clover. So we're using Clover to do a lot of the transactions of Supplier. So for example, if a customer has pretty loose processes around the things that we discussed today with Supplier Management, we'll implement the Supplier Management module in ARIS. And then what happens is every time a supplier is added, we automatically create the supplier in ERP. And then some of the field data that we're passing is the qualification data. So in PLM, as I'm using the reports and the scorecard to go qualify that supplier status is also being passed to ERP. So that both the ERP users, whether it be SAP, NetSuite, Oracle EBS, JDE, those are all platforms we've done this with. Whether it be those ERP users or the PLM users, they can see who the suppliers are and what the status of those suppliers is.
Perfect. Thank you, Rodney. I have another question. Do suppliers have access to the portal, and what are the things that they can do in the system?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So this is actually pretty exciting. So I think it was last year at the ACE conference, we got to see a little bit about ARIS' strategy for Supplier Access. So we've actually been able to leverage that with a few clients, as well as do some custom integrations. So that's actually allowing the suppliers themselves to interact and see their qualification status, as well as provide some of the supplier certificates and things. So I talked about this a little bit earlier in our intro, but imagine that every time you bring on a supplier, there is a set of documentation, a supplier agreement, a supplier certificate, maybe a supplier qualification document, as well as some of the standard ERP certification stuff that they have to have.
every supplier has to have these 5 documents before we can use them, right? So now in PLM, whenever I create a supplier template automatically creates those 5 documents. Those 5 documents are automatically sent to that supplier, and using their access into our ARIS environment, they can then populate the supplier documents, the attachments that they need, sign off, get certified, and all of that is happening electronically. So no email, no drive-by communication, nothing falls through the cracks, everything's managed. And then what we just recently did with a client, as that certification comes back around, let's say that you have to do that annually, as that time approaches, let's say it's 30 days ahead of time, we send out a notification to the people responsible for that. So the owner of that supplier process gets notified, the supplier, because they have access in the portal, gets notified, and that process starts off. So again, we had a number of clients that came to us with the problem that we've got this loose supplier process, and what really happens is the deadline comes and we find out we've got a bunch of documentation we need to get done that we weren't even aware of. So again, just getting all that information into the system, processing it, right, building a business process around it really helps that to flow more smoothly.
Great, thank you, Rodney. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please enter them into the question panel. Looking to see if there's any more. From Angela, it looks like, I like the supplier portal idea, mainly a little bit of topic, but is this actually possible without voiding GDPR?
Yes, I mean, we're doing it. So using either the ARIS supplier portal solution or using integration. So we have some customers, they have their own supplier web portals, and what we're doing in those cases is building an integration, again using Clover, to that web portal to ARIS, and all that stuff passes those certifications and requirements. Now, depending on your business, your organization, those are things that we have to take into consideration when we're building those solutions. So if there's sensitive data that we can't transfer, if there's certain walls, I'll say, kind of in air quotes, that we need to put up to prevent people from being able to get to certain information, all that's possible with the ARIS data model.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rodney. Are there any other questions? Well, it looks like we have now completed our Q&A session. Rodney, is there any closing remarks that you would like to have?
Yeah, I would just, I was having a little bit of connection problems, but I had one slide I was going to show here that just talks about our upcoming webinar. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. It was great for Derek to be able to show the technology. I know last time we did a lot of talking, so we're going to continue in this mode for the next 2 presentations. Pretty excited to show the change management and training management modules. So I'd encourage you all to come to those sessions and bring your questions. So just thank everyone for their time, and we'll look forward to seeing you in those next webinars.
Great. So this concludes our webinar for today, and we look forward to your attendance on our next webinar, which will be Streamline Your Change Management Process, and that's going to be on Wednesday, June 3rd at 12 o'clock. And as Rodney's mentioned, it is regarding the change management module. And again, we appreciate your time and participation today, and we do apologize for the technical difficulties. And thanks again, and stay healthy.
Thanks.